When I saw my ATV missing from the garage, I thought maybe one of my workers had borrowed it. But when I checked the security footage, my jaw dropped. It was Karen's daughter, strolling in broad daylight, giggling as she rode off like she owned the place. The same Karen who'd bragged about her untouchable daughter, saying her husband's connections would make any problem disappear. Well, not this time. That ATV wasn't just a toy, it was a customized off-roader worth 15 grand, and I had every piece of it registered. What Karen didn't know was that my security system didn't just record, it streamed directly to the county sheriff's office. By the time she realized what her daughter had done, the cops were already on their way. What started as a spoiled kid's joyride ended with handcuffs, a mugshot, and a neighborhood that would never forget what real justice looks like. Asterisk. Saturday mornings were usually my favorite time of the week. I'd get up early, grab a mug of hot coffee, and step outside to the crisp air that carried the scent of pine and freshly cut grass. My garage was my little kingdom, filled with tools, spare parts, and the one thing I truly treasured, my ATV. It wasn't just any all-terrain vehicle. It was a machine I'd spent months restoring. Every dent, every paint stripe, every customized feature was done by hand. That ATV had seen trails, mountains, and mud pits that most folks in this suburban neighborhood wouldn't dream of touching. That morning started out like any other. The sun was just climbing over the rooftops, and the neighborhood was coming alive. I could hear lawnmowers starting up, dogs barking, and the faint hum of sprinklers ticking away. I'd just finished washing my truck and turned to roll up the hose when I noticed something strange. The side door of my garage was open, not wide, but just enough for a shadow to slip through. I frowned, thinking maybe I'd forgotten to shut it the night before. But that wasn't like me. I'm the kind of guy who double-checks locks twice, once before bed and once after my morning coffee. Still, I shrugged it off and walked over. But when I stepped inside, my chest went cold. The space where my ATV usually sat, right there beside my tool rack, was empty. At first I froze. My mind tried to reason through what I was seeing. Maybe I'd moved it to the shed. Maybe one of my friends borrowed it. But no one had access to that garage but me. I walked in slow, scanning the floor. The faint smell of exhaust hung in the air, still fresh. That told me whatever happened, it wasn't long ago. I pulled out my phone and checked the time. 9:42 a.m. I replayed the morning in my head. I'd gone to bed early, locked up, and slept straight through the night. The side door was secure, the garage button was off. So how did someone get in? That's when I noticed the footprints. Small, probably size 7 or 8, and not boots, but sneakers. They led straight from the door to where the ATV had been parked. The prints were faint, but enough to tell me this wasn't some random thief sneaking around in the dark. This was someone who knew exactly what they wanted. My first instinct was to call the police. But then I remembered something. My security cameras. I had installed them a few months ago after the HOA accidentally issued me a fine for having construction equipment visible from the street. Ever since then, I made sure every inch of my property was covered. I walked over to the small monitor by the workbench, hit rewind, and waited. What I saw made my blood boil. At 8:17 a.m. The camera caught a young woman walking right up my driveway. Blonde hair, pink hoodie, phone in one hand, sipping an iced coffee like she was out for a stroll. I knew that face. Tiffany, Karen's daughter. Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA. The woman who had made my life miserable since the day I moved in. And there was her daughter, casually pushing open my garage door like she owned the place. The video showed her walking straight up to the ATV. She didn't hesitate, didn't look nervous, didn't even check for cameras. She climbed on, pressed the ignition button, and to my disbelief, it started. I had left the key in the ignition after tuning it last night. A small mistake that now cost me thousands. Tiffany revved the engine, laughed, and shouted something that the camera barely picked up. When I replayed it twice, I caught it clearly. Mom says no one can touch me. Then she sped off down the street, dirt flying behind her. I leaned back against the workbench, jaw clenched. It wasn't just about the ATV, it was about the audacity. The nerve of that girl to walk into my property, steal my vehicle, and boast about being untouchable. I shouldn't have been surprised, really. Karen had raised her that way. Karen moved into the neighborhood about 6 months ago. From day one, she acted like she owned the place. She'd show up at HOA meetings demanding new rules, no parking trucks in driveways. No tools visible in garages, no unsightly garden sheds. And when I politely told her my property was my business, she smiled that tight-lipped smile and said, "Rules are rules unless you know the right people." Her daughter, Tiffany, was a mirror image of her, entitled, loud, and convinced the world revolved around her. I'd caught her a few times racing through the neighborhood in her little convertible, blasting music so loud it rattled the windows. Once, I even saw her spray painting her name on the community sign, and when a neighbor reported it, Karen turned it around, saying the HOA was targeting her family. Somehow, she got away with it. Every time. But this time, I wasn't going to let it slide. I grabbed my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for the county sheriff's office. I wasn't calling the HOA or Karen. This was theft, plain and simple. When the dispatcher picked up, I explained everything: the missing ATV, the footage, the suspect. There was a short pause on the other end before the deputy asked, "Did you say Karen Holloway's daughter?" "Yeah," I said flatly. He sighed. "You're not the first person to call about her. We'll send a unit over shortly." That gave me some relief, but it also told me something. Tiffany had been on their radar for a while. I saved the footage onto a flash drive and made a copy on my phone, just in case. Then I went outside and stood on the driveway, waiting. The wind carried the faint echo of an ATV somewhere in the distance. My fists tightened. That was my machine. She was joyriding. A few minutes later, I saw Karen's front door swing open. She stood there in her robe, talking on the phone, waving her hands around like she was giving a speech. Even from across the street, I could hear her voice, sharp, commanding, dripping with arrogance. Of course, she didn't steal anything. She said into the phone, "We have friends at City Hall. No one's going to make a big deal out of this." I couldn't believe it. She already knew. I went back inside, sat down at my desk, and took a deep breath. The deputy would handle it. I just needed to stay calm. But deep down, I knew one thing. This wasn't just about missing a TV anymore. It was about a family that thought they were untouchable finally being reminded that laws apply to everyone. And as I replayed the footage one more time, watching Tiffany's smug grin as she rode off, I made a silent promise to myself this time. Justice wouldn't be swept under the rug. Not by Karen, not by her connections, not by anyone. By the time the sheriff's deputies arrived, the whole neighborhood already knew something was going on. News travels fast when you live in a place like Maple Ridge Estates, a quiet suburban community that pretended to be peaceful but thrived on gossip. From the moment I called the sheriff's office, I knew that every curtain in the street would be slightly open, every neighbor pretending to water their plants while eavesdropping, and at the center of all this attention stood one woman, Karen Holloway, the queen of the HOA. Karen wasn't just any homeowner. She ran the Homeowners Association like it was her personal empire. She had that kind of confidence that came not from leadership, but from control, the kind that made people afraid to disagree with her. She walked around the neighborhood with her clipboard, issuing warnings about grass length, mailbox colors, and even where kids could play. To her, rules were weapons, and she knew how to use them. When she first moved in, people liked her. She was polished, charming, and always throwing fancy community gatherings that looked more like political rallies than friendly barbecues. But once she got voted in as HOA president, everything changed. Suddenly, everyone had to follow her vision of perfection. Trash cans couldn't be visible, fences had to match her chosen shade of suburban beige, and God forbid someone park a work truck in their driveway overnight. She made enemies fast, but no one dared to challenge her directly, except me. I wasn't one to bend easily, especially when someone thought they could tell me how to live on my own land. When Karen tried to find me for having industrial equipment in my garage, meaning my lawnmower and tool rack, I pushed back. I went to the HOA meeting, laid out the bylaws, and proved that nothing I was doing violated their rules. She didn't like that one bit. From then on, I became her least favorite neighbor, and as it turned out, her daughter Tiffany had learned every bit of that arrogance from her mother. That morning, after the deputies left a voicemail saying they were on their way, I stood by the window and watched Karen pacing across her driveway. She was on the phone, talking fast, gesturing wildly, her robe flapping in the wind. I couldn't hear every word, but I caught enough. Ridiculous. He's lying, and I'll handle it. It was obvious who she was talking about. Me, just then. Her daughter came strolling down the street like nothing had happened. Tiffany wore that same pink hoodie I'd seen in the footage, her blonde hair bouncing as she chewed gum. She wasn't scared or guilty. She was smiling when she spotted me watching from the porch. She actually waved. "Nice ride," she shouted with a laugh. "You should thank me. I took it for a spin to make sure it still works." It took every ounce of patience not to march across the street and tell her exactly what I thought. But I stayed put. I wasn't about to give Karen the satisfaction of saying I'd harassed her daughter. I simply folded my arms and said, "You're going to regret that joyride, Tiffany." She rolled her eyes and laughed. "You sound just like the principal at school." "Whatever. My mom said we'll handle it." Those words, "we'll handle it," told me everything I needed to know. Karen already had a plan, and I knew it wouldn't involve admitting her daughter was wrong. Not long after, the first patrol car rolled into the neighborhood. The blue lights reflected off the manicured lawns as Deputy Collins stepped out, a man I'd met before when a neighbor's dog went missing. He was calm, polite, and sharp. I greeted him at the curb and handed over the flash drive with the security footage. He glanced at the house across the street. "So, the suspect is the HOA president's daughter." "Yep," I said flatly, "and she's not denying it either." He gave a short whistle. "This should be interesting." Together we walked toward Karen's house. The deputy knocked firmly on the door. It swung open almost instantly, as if she'd been waiting. "Good morning, ma'am," Collins began. "We're here about a report of stolen property, specifically, an ATV belonging to your neighbor." Karen smiled sweetly, but her eyes were sharp as glass. "Oh, this is nonsense," she said smoothly. "Tiffany was just borrowing it for a quick ride. We were going to return it." I bit my tongue, letting the deputy handle it. Collins nodded patiently. "Ma'am, even borrowing without permission is considered unauthorized use. Do you happen to know where the ATV is right now?" She hesitated for half a second, just long enough to give herself away, and then shouted over her shoulder, "Tiffany, bring that thing back here." A minute later, the sound of the ATV echoed down the street. There she was, Tiffany, mud on her boots and a grin on her face, riding my ATV right up to the curb. The sight of her so smug made my blood boil. When she parked it, the deputy walked over to inspect it. The paint was scratched, the seat torn, and one of the mirrors cracked. My beautiful machine looked like it had been through a storm. Collins turned to Tiffany. "Miss, did you have permission to use this vehicle?" She shrugged. "It was unlocked. I just borrowed it. It's not like he needed it right away." Karen stepped in quickly, her tone firm but controlled. "Officer, my daughter didn't mean any harm. She's a responsible young woman. I think this is all being blown out of proportion. I can assure you, we'll handle this privately." Collins crossed his arms. "Ma'am, the property owner has provided video evidence showing your daughter entering his garage without consent and taking his ATV. That's theft under state law. It's not something we can just handle privately." The color drained from Karen's face, though she tried to keep her composure. Tiffany, however, smirked and said, "You can't arrest me. My mom knows people." That did it. Collins sighed and reached for his radio. "Dispatch, I need a juvenile transport unit at Maple Ridge Estates. Theft, suspect in custody." Karen's voice rose in panic. "You can't be serious. She's just a child. She's never even been in trouble before." I stayed silent, watching as the deputy calmly recited Tiffany's rights. It was a surreal moment, the queen of the HOA standing helpless as her untouchable daughter faced real consequences for the first time. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, some even stepping outside to watch. Karen noticed and yelled, "This is harassment. You'll all regret this." But no one said a word. The silence was louder than any response. As the second patrol car arrived, Tiffany was placed inside, still muttering under her breath about how unfair it all was. Karen glared at me with eyes that could cut steel. "You think this makes you some kind of hero?" she hissed. "No," I said quietly, "just someone who believes in consequences." And with that, the deputies drove off. The sirens faded, leaving behind a neighborhood so still you could hear the wind rustle through the trees. Karen stood there in her driveway, arms crossed, fury simmering beneath her perfect smile. I turned and walked back to my porch, the weight of justice finally starting to sink in. I knew this wasn't over. Karen would come after me in some way, through the HOA, through petty fines, maybe even false reports. But it didn't matter, because for the first time she had learned that her power wasn't limitless. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning of a battle she thought she could win, but I was ready for every round of it. The neighborhood had never seen anything like it. Maple Ridge Estates was a place where the biggest scandal used to be, whose lawn got yard of the month. But that morning changed everything. The sight of Tiffany, the golden girl of the HOA president, being handcuffed on her own driveway became the talk of every house for weeks. What made it worse, at least for Karen, was that everyone had seen it. Cameras, phones, neighbors, all of them watching her perfect image crumble in real time. After the deputies left with Tiffany, the silence that followed felt heavier than the rumble of the patrol car. I remember standing on my porch, watching Karen pace back and forth like a storm ready to explode. Her robe flapped around her legs, her phone glued to her ear, barking at whoever was unfortunate enough to answer her calls. I could tell from her tone that she was already trying to pull strings, trying to make the arrest go away. I went inside and poured myself another cup of coffee, hands still trembling from the rush of adrenaline. I wasn't celebrating, but I couldn't help feeling a quiet sense of justice. For months, Karen had acted like she was untouchable, and now the world had finally seen what kind of person she really was. Not 15 minutes later, there was a knock on my door. When I opened it, Karen stood there. No robe this time, just a sleek black dress and oversized sunglasses. The kind meant to hide emotions, but nothing could mask the rage in her voice. "You've made a huge mistake," she hissed, stepping closer without waiting to be invited in. "Do you have any idea who my husband is?" I crossed my arms. "Doesn't matter who he is. Your daughter stole my property, Karen. That's not a misunderstanding, that's a crime." "She didn't steal anything," she snapped. "She borrowed it. You left the key in it. It's your own fault for being careless." I stared at her, disbelief washing over me. "You're seriously blaming me for your daughter breaking into my garage?" She lifted her chin defiantly. "I'm saying this could have been avoided if you weren't so dramatic. You've humiliated my family for no reason. But don't worry, I'll make sure the HOA knows how you treat your neighbors." There it was, the threat I'd been expecting. She couldn't win through reason, so she'd try to use power. Before I could respond, she leaned in closer. "You'll regret this," she whispered. "I promise you that." And just like that, she turned and stormed off, heels clicking against the driveway like warning shots. That night, I couldn't sleep. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from neighbors, some offering support, others asking for details. It was strange how people who barely waved before now wanted to chat about justice and fairness. I ignored most of them. The last thing I needed was more gossip, but one message stood out. It was from Deputy Collins. "Just an update. Tiffany's being processed at juvenile intake. They'll hold her overnight for questioning. Looks like the DA wants to pursue charges, theft, and property damage. We'll keep you informed." Reading that, I felt a mix of relief and sadness. Relief that the law was doing its job, but sadness that it even had to come to this. I didn't want a kid's life ruined, I just wanted accountability. The next morning, the sun rose over a neighborhood divided. Some people avoided me altogether, worried about getting on Karen's bad side. Others greeted me more warmly than usual, whispering things like, "It's about time someone stood up to her." But when I opened my front door, I found a letter taped to it. It was from the HOA. "Dear resident, it has come to our attention that law enforcement activity occurred at your property, causing disturbance and discomfort to nearby homeowners. Please be reminded that any behavior contributing to neighborhood tension may result in review by the HOA board." At the bottom, signed in bold letters, President, Karen Holloway. I actually laughed. It was so petty, so predictable, that it almost didn't surprise me. She was trying to twist the story, paint me as the troublemaker. I took a photo of the letter and emailed it straight to Deputy Collins. "Attaching the footage again, just in case," I wrote. A few hours later, another patrol car showed up, but this time, it wasn't for me. The officer walked up to Karen's door, and the whole street watched again. It turned out the sheriff's department wanted to collect statements and inspect the damaged ATV. I stood beside the officer as he took photos, noting the cracked mirror, the bent handlebars, and the muddy frame. Karen stood on her porch the whole time, arms crossed, pretending not to watch. But the tension was thick enough to feel. When the officer finished, he turned to me and said, "You might want to know, sir, the case is moving forward. The footage is clear. The DA is filing charges against the juvenile. You'll likely be called to testify." "Understood," I said quietly. By evening, word had spread beyond our neighborhood. Someone had recorded the entire incident on their phone, the arrest, the argument, everything, and posted it online. Within hours, the clip hit local social media pages with captions like "HOA President's daughter arrested for theft," and "Karen's karma arrives." It went viral fast. Even the local news station picked it up. Karen must have seen it too, because the next morning, her husband, Richard, showed up at my door. He was a tall man with silver hair and a politician's smile, the kind that looked warm but never reached his eyes. "Listen," he began, trying for diplomacy. "I think we can come to an understanding here. Kids make mistakes. Let's not ruin her future over one bad decision." I folded my arms. It wasn't a mistake when she bragged about being untouchable. He sighed. "You're angry? I get that. But dragging this through court helps no one. What do you want? Money? Repairs? We'll pay." I shook my head. "It's not about money. It's about accountability. Your wife and daughter have spent months acting like rules don't apply to them. Maybe this will remind them that they do." His friendly smile cracked. "You're making a big mistake," he said, voice dropping. "You don't know who you're dealing with." "I think I do," I replied, "and that's exactly why I won't back down." He glared at me for a moment, then turned and walked off, muttering under his breath. That evening, a police cruiser returned Tiffany home after her initial hearing. She stepped out, mascara streaked, eyes red from crying. For the first time, she didn't look smug, she looked scared. Karen rushed out to hug her, glaring at anyone who dared to watch. I stood by my mailbox, saying nothing. Part of me felt bad for Tiffany. She was just a product of her mother's arrogance. But another part of me knew that real lessons don't come from lectures. They come from consequences. That night, as the lights in Karen's house went dark, I looked out at my repaired ATV and exhaled slowly. The neighborhood had changed forever. The queen of the HOA had finally been dethroned, and for the first time in a long while, justice had parked itself right in my driveway. The days that followed were unlike anything Maple Ridge Estates had ever seen. The once peaceful, overly controlled community, where Karen Holloway ruled every rule, every meeting, and every fine, suddenly turned into a battlefield of whispers, finger-pointing, and broken loyalties. It wasn't just gossip anymore. It was open rebellion. For years, the residents had quietly suffered under her reign, afraid to speak out. But now, after Tiffany's arrest and the viral video that refused to die online, Karen's reputation was shattered. The queen had lost her crown, and no amount of polished smiles could glue it back together. Still, she tried. 3 days after Tiffany's release, the HOA sent out an emergency meeting notice. The subject line read, "Urgent clarification regarding recent events." It was clearly Karen's attempt at damage control. The meeting was scheduled for Friday evening in the community clubhouse. Everyone knew it wasn't really about clarification. It was about saving face. When Friday came, I walked into the clubhouse, unsure what to expect. The air was thick, people whispering, glaring, pretending to check their phones but clearly waiting for drama. Karen sat at the front table, back straight, dressed in her usual power outfit, navy blazer, pearls, and that smug confidence she wore like armor. Tiffany wasn't there, but her absence hung in the room like a shadow. "Good evening, everyone," Karen began, her voice smooth and steady. "I know there's been some misinformation circulating about recent events involving my family. I want to set the record straight before false rumors damage the good name of our community." A murmur rippled through the crowd. She continued, My daughter made an honest mistake. A misunderstanding. Really? She thought she had permission to use our neighbor's ATV, and unfortunately, it was blown out of proportion. The situation is being resolved privately, and I would appreciate if we all moved on from this unnecessary drama. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Misinformation? Misunderstanding? My jaw tightened. I'd stayed quiet through her antics for months, but this was too much. I stood up from my chair. Karen, I said firmly, with all due respect, that's not what happened. Your daughter broke into my garage, took my ATV without permission, damaged it, and bragged about being untouchable. That's not a misunderstanding, that's theft. And there's video proof. Dozens of heads turned toward me. Karen's smile faltered for just a second before she regained her composure. Mr. Daniels, she said, her tone icy, this meeting isn't about personal disputes. It's about community peace. Perhaps you'd like to discuss your grievances privately, instead of privately. I cut in. You made it public the moment your daughter got arrested on her driveway in front of everyone. Gasps echoed around the room. Karen's face flushed. You're out of line, she snapped. No, I said, my voice calm but steady. For once, I'm not the one out of line. The room fell silent. No one had ever spoken to Karen that way before, at least, not publicly. You could feel the tension crackle in the air like static. Finally, one of the neighbors, Mrs. Reynolds, stood up. She was one of Karen's oldest supporters, always defending her, but now she looked tired. Karen, she said softly, we all saw the video. Maybe it's time to admit your daughter made a mistake. Karen turned on her sharply. You weren't there, Evelyn? Another neighbor chimed in. We've all been fined, threatened, or embarrassed by your rules for years. Karen, maybe it's time you stepped down from the HOA. The words hit her like a punch. Her lips trembled, but she quickly masked it with anger. This is absurd, she said, slamming her clipboard on the table. You're all turning on me because of one stupid video. After everything I've done for this neighborhood. Done for us? A man from the back scoffed. You mean done to us? Voices started rising. The room turned chaotic, neighbors arguing, old grievances spilling out like floodwater. For years, people had swallowed their frustrations, but now, one by one, they let them pour out. Karen's power had always been built on fear, but fear had finally broken in the middle of the noise. I saw something shift in her eyes. Panic. She realized the room was no longer hers. The crown she wore so proudly was gone. Someone called for a vote, right there. In that heated moment to remove Karen as HOA president, the motion passed almost unanimously. Only 2 hands stayed down, hers and one nervous man who quickly lowered his after people glared. Karen stood there frozen. The color drained from her face. Her voice, when it came, was barely more than a whisper. You can't do this. But they already had. I thought she might storm out. But instead, she just stood there, trembling slightly, staring at the people she once commanded. Then, without a word, she gathered her papers, pressed her lips together, and walked out of the clubhouse. The door shut behind her with a quiet thud, the sound of her reign ending. After the meeting, several neighbors came up to thank me. They said it took courage to speak out, but honestly, I didn't feel brave. I just felt tired. Tired of bullies hiding behind rules. Tired of people like Karen thinking the world owed them special treatment. Later that night, as I walked home under the pale streetlights, I saw Karen's house across the street. The blinds were drawn, but I could see her silhouette pacing. For the first time, the grand 2-story house looked small, lonely. There were no visitors, no cars parked out front, no laughter, just silence. The next morning, a new HOA announcement was sent out, this time, from the interim president, Mr. Hale. The message was short and simple, effective immediately. Karen Holloway has stepped down as HOA president. We thank her for her past service and wish her well. The community exhaled in relief. For the first time in years, people smiled at each other without that undercurrent of fear. Kids played in driveways again, trucks parked without warning, slips tucked under wipers. The air felt lighter, but as peaceful as it seemed, I knew Karen wasn't done yet. People like her don't just fade quietly. Pride like that doesn't crumble overnight. And I was right. That evening, as I stood outside polishing my newly repaired ATV, a car rolled up to my driveway. Karen stepped out, no longer polished or composed. Her hair was messy, her eyes red from crying, but there was still a flicker of that old defiance in her gaze. You think you won, she said bitterly. You think humiliating me fixed anything? I put down the rag and looked her in the eye. No, Karen, I think you did this to yourself. Her lip quivered, anger and regret mixing in her expression. You'll regret this, she muttered again, the same threat she'd used before, but this time, it sounded hollow. She turned and got back into her car, tires screeching as she sped off into the fading light. As I watched her drive away, I realized something. People like Karen only have power when others let them. The moment you stop fearing them, they lose everything. And in that moment, for the first time since moving into Maple Ridge Estates, I felt free. The next few days felt like a strange calm after a storm. The neighborhood, once ruled by Karen's sharp tongue and endless HOA complaints, had fallen quiet. For the first time since I moved in, I could hear the wind rustling through the trees without her barking at someone over violations. But under that peace, tension still brewed. Everyone knew Tiffany's court date was approaching, and Karen had been hiding behind drawn curtains ever since the police hauled her daughter away. Her once daily walks where she'd flaunt her new handbags or gossip about everyone's lawns had completely stopped. The queen bee had finally gone silent. I spent most of those days fixing my ATV. It had deep mud stains, scratches on the paint, and a dent in the side that must have come from Tiffany's little joyride. Every scrape told me something about her recklessness. She'd probably taken it off-road without any idea how to handle it. But I wasn't angry anymore. As I polished the engine, I felt something closer to relief. It was finally over, and I didn't have to say a word. The truth, recorded by my cameras and confirmed by the sheriff's department, had done all the talking for me. Still, curiosity got the best of me. I wanted to know what would happen next. So when I received a call from Deputy Simmons, the same officer who'd taken Tiffany in, I answered before the first ring finished. "Mr. Cole," he said, his voice steady but friendly. "Just wanted to give you an update. The girl's being charged with theft and vandalism. Judge set a hearing for Friday morning." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Any chance they'll try to fight it?" "Karen's tried to call in favors," he said with a quiet laugh. "But no one's touching this." The footage was too clear. The judge saw it personally. That Friday, I drove to the courthouse. I didn't need to be there, but something inside me wanted to see justice with my own eyes. The building was small, red brick, 2 stories, with a courthouse bell that looked older than the town itself. When I stepped inside, I saw Karen sitting on a wooden bench, wearing dark sunglasses and a blazer far too formal for the occasion. Tiffany sat beside her, arms crossed, her face pale, and eyes puffy from crying. The arrogance she once wore like armor had completely vanished. She looked like a scared kid, one who'd finally realized the world didn't bend just because her mom said so. When the bailiff called her name, Karen stood up quickly, holding Tiffany's arm like she could somehow control the situation by sheer force of will. I took a seat near the back. The judge, a calm older man with silver hair, peered over his glasses. "Miss Tiffany Caldwell," he began, "you've been charged with theft of private property, unlawful entry, and property damage. How do you plead?" Karen jumped in before Tiffany could answer. "Your Honor, my daughter made a simple mistake. She thought it was just a friendly borrowing. She didn't mean any harm." The judge didn't even glance at her. "Mrs. Caldwell, I'm speaking to your daughter." Tiffany swallowed hard. I didn't think it was a big deal," she whispered. The judge leaned back, his expression unreadable. "You entered a man's garage, took his registered vehicle without permission, and damaged it. That's a big deal in this county." Karen shifted in her seat, her lips tightening. "With all due respect, Your Honor, this community has always handled small issues privately. We don't need to ruin a young girl's future over." The judge cut her off with a firm tap of his gavel. "Enough, Mrs. Caldwell. This isn't a community issue. This is the law." For the next half hour, they reviewed the evidence. The video footage played on a small screen at the front, showing Tiffany's smirking face as she hopped onto my ATV. The sound of her saying, "Mom says no one can touch me," echoed across the courtroom. Karen's face flushed crimson. A few people in the back murmured quietly. I recognized some of them neighbors who'd come just to see this unfold. When the clip ended, the judge sighed. "It's clear what happened here," he said finally. "Miss Caldwell, the court is sentencing you to 100 hours of community service, restitution for damages totaling $2,700, and mandatory attendance at a responsibility awareness program. You will also write a formal apology to the victim." Karen gasped like she'd been slapped. "That's outrageous." The judge turned his sharp eyes toward her. "What's outrageous, Mrs. Caldwell, is a parent teaching their child they're above consequences. You may take your seat before I hold you in contempt." Tiffany broke down in tears. Karen's shoulders slumped, her confidence shattered. I sat silently, watching justice happen in real time. There was no yelling, no gloating, no revenge, just truth, cold and undeniable. After the hearing, I stepped outside, ready to leave it all behind. Karen and Tiffany came out moments later. She spotted me across the steps, froze, then whispered something to her daughter before walking past without a word. Tiffany looked up briefly, her eyes red, and murmured, "I'm sorry." I didn't respond right away. Part of me wanted to scold her, to tell her how careless and entitled she'd been, but I could see she'd already learned her lesson. "It's done," I said quietly. "Just don't do it again." She nodded and followed her mother to their car. Over the next few weeks, life in the neighborhood changed. The HOA meetings grew calmer, and for once, no one had to hear Karen lecture them about community standards. Tiffany started cleaning the park on weekends as part of her service hours. It was humbling to see the same girl who once bragged about being untouchable, now picking up litter with her headphones on. I didn't gloat or tease her. Sometimes, I'd just give her a nod when I passed by. That was enough. One evening, as the sun set, I rolled my repaired ATV out of the garage. The engine purred like it was brand new. I took it for a slow ride around the block. When I passed Karen's house, she was outside watering her plants. For the first time since we'd become neighbors, she didn't glare or bark orders. She simply nodded, a quiet acknowledgement, maybe even a truce. I nodded back, then throttled forward, letting the cool breeze wash away the last of the bitterness. As I drove off, I realized something simple but powerful. Revenge never fixes anything. But justice, real, fair justice, brings peace. I didn't need to ruin Karen. The truth had already done that. What mattered now was moving on, leaving that chapter behind, and remembering that no one, no matter how loud or powerful they seem, is ever truly untouchable. And as the stars blinked above the quiet street, I smiled, finally free of the chaos that had once ruled our little corner of the world. For more powerful true life stories like this, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel, HOA Bright Reality. Real stories, real consequences, real justice, only on HOA Bright Reality.